Hi and welcome. This week I'm taking a look at the Royal Enfield Himalayan. This is really an all-new model for Royal Enfield and certainly not based on anything that they've produced previously. It's a dual-purpose motorcycle, so even that is a bit of a departure for Royal Enfield. It's got an all-new engine design, all-new chassis, and it certainly looks quite different to the other models in their range. Now, my first impressions were quite pleasing. It has fairly slow steering, but given its dual-purpose nature, that's probably a bit of a given. You don't really want particularly fast steering when you're in the dirt. Now, the power delivery from the engine is very forgiving. It has quite good torque down low, and it certainly delivers the power in such a manner that off-road you certainly aren't going to be caught out in any way. Now, for suspension, it has a 41mm conventional fork on the front, which is non-adjustable with about 200mm of travel. On the rear, we've got a rising rate single shock, which is adjustable for preload only. It gives around 180mm of travel. Now, I found the suspension at both ends quite plush. It wasn't too soft. It seemed reasonably well damped and certainly worked really well on our poor roads here and also in the dirt. Braking is taken care of at the front with a 300mm disc with a 2-piston caliper, and on the rear we've got a 220mm disc with a single piston caliper. Now, fairly firm pressure is required on the front brake lever to get the bike to stop, but given its dual purpose nature, you really don't want a front brake that is a little bit too prone to bite on the first grab of the lever. I do believe that next year that anti-lock braking will be available on this particular model, but the 2017 model doesn't have anti-lock braking. Now, the rear brake is actually quite good. It actually gives quite a good braking effect. It's probably due to the weight distribution on this bike. It's certainly far more effective than on your average sports bike, I found. Now, the wheels, we've got a 21-inch laced wheel on the front that uses a steel rim, and on the rear we've got a 17-inch steel rim that's also a laced wheel. The tyre sizes we've got a 90-90-21 on the front and a 120-90-17 on the rear. Now, the tyres are not a brand that I'm familiar with, and they seem to work really well in the dry on the road, but I can't say what they'd be like in the wet. Off-road, it's been a long time since I've ridden off-road on a bike, so I'm probably not the most reliable person to give an opinion on the tyres in the dirt, but I did find that the front did have a tendency to wander a fair bit in the gravel, probably no more than any other dirt bike would have, but you know, again, it's not something that I can really speak of with great authority. Now, the engine, as I said, is an all-new design, and it's also the first overhead cam model that Royal Enfield have produced. It's a single overhead cam, 2-valve air oil-cooled engine. The engine runs an oil cooler on the side there, and certainly the power delivery of the engine is quite good. It's a long stroke motor. That means that the stroke is longer than the bore, which means that it's quite a torquey engine. It also means that the engine doesn't rev particularly high. The sweet spot for this particular engine is between 4,000 RPM and 5,500 RPM. And certainly if you keep it up over 4,000 RPM and change up once the engine is over 5,000 RPM or 5,500 RPM, you get quite good acceleration. Certainly if you open the throttle anywhere in that RPM range, the bike certainly does accelerate, not briskly like a modern sports bike, but certainly with enough authority for you to enjoy the power delivery of the engine. Now, the controls on the bike are fairly standard and typical of most modern Japanese and Italian bikes. In fact, they're styled in a very similar manner. They seem well made and everything functioned as it should. Now, the dash is a little bit different in that we have a large speedo with an inset LCD display, and that display shows odometer, trip meter, a gear position indicator, and to the side of that we've got a much smaller tacho, which is quite useful. And below that we've got a fuel gauge and a digital compass. It's a bit of a novelty. and was probably put there as a bit of a sales gimmick. Perhaps it could be useful. I didn't find it particularly accurate. It was always seemed to be lagging a little bit behind the position that the bike was pointing in, but in saying that, it's sort of an interesting thing. Now, the fit and finish of the motorcycle is certainly, well, I don't know whether you'd call it a step up from Royal Enfield's other bikes, but the paint quality is very good. The fittings that they've used, such as the fuel cap, are quite nicely finished. The paintwork on the frame is nice, and as an added touch, they've fitted a stainless steel exhaust system to this bike. Now, all other Royal Enfield motorcycles have a chrome steel system, and the fitting of a stainless steel system to this bike makes it a little bit more corrosion resistant. Now, the muffler gives quite a muted sound. It's certainly not going to annoy the neighbours. You'll actually get a little bit more noise from the engine. Oh, and I should also point out that this motorcycle is not fuel injected. It actually does have a carburetor with a choke fitted to it, and there's also a fuel tap with a off, on and a reserve position. Not that much choke was required when the engine was cold to get it going. You just pulled the choke out, started it, and you can pretty much back the choke off straight away. You did find as the engine was warming up, you'd get a little bit of backfiring on deceleration and a little lack of power, but in saying that, it certainly wasn't that much worse than the fuel-injected Royal Enfields. Now, who's this motorcycle aimed for? I think in Australia, it's certainly aimed at the budget-conscious buyer. Whether that's a learner motorcyclist, and certainly it's ideal for the learner in that the steering and the handling is very confidence-inspiring, and the engine is not going to get you into trouble. And it certainly has more than adequate braking for the performance of the motorcycle. The motorcycle is quite comfortable, though I did find the seat probably a little bit soft for my body weight. Now, I'm around 90 kilos, and I found that the foam was probably a little bit soft. It was fine for an hour or two, but I think for an all-day ride, you may want to put a base of slightly harder foam underneath the fairly soft foam on the top. Now, the motorcycle's also got good luggage carrying capacity. There's a rack on the back, and there's also accessory panniers that you can get for it. So there's certainly a lot of choice for carrying luggage on this. Now, for the more advanced rider, I think even they would get something out of this if they're looking for a dual-purpose motorcycle and they're on a fairly limited budget. Again, as I said earlier, if you keep the speed between the 60 to 100 km/h range, you'll find it really pleasant tootling around the hills, using the torque curve of the engine and just enjoying the scenery and enjoying riding the motorcycle. It's actually quite a fun motorcycle to ride, even with its performance limitations. And you're certainly going to have to try quite hard to lose your license on this motorcycle. Now, I'd like to thank A1 Motorcycles in Ringwood, Australia, for loaning me the Royal Enfield Himalayan, and you'll find their contact details in the description below. I'll see you next time.